Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar where we will be unpacking three CCS business models in the UK, namely power, BECCS, and greenhouse gas removals. This webinar is the second in a three-part series focused on the status of CCS in the UK. My name is Dominic Rasool. I am Senior Business Development Lead here in Europe at the Global CCS Institute, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Global CCS Institute is an international think tank whose mission it is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage, a vital technology needed to tackle climate change and deliver carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. The first part of this webinar provided by a high-level overview of, the first part of this webinar series provided a high-level overview of CCS business models in the UK. In today's session, we will zero in on three of those business models: the Dispatchable Power Agreement, or the DPA, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or power BECCS, and greenhouse gas removals. Providing an overview of these business models are the experts supporting their development at the UK Government Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero. Joanna Warner is the Deputy Director of Net Zero Frameworks, and Ben Smith is the Deputy Director of Power CCUS. Globally, carbon capture and storage is gaining ground as a key climate technology with over 350 projects in various stages of development. With over £20 billion allocated to support the deployment of the technology in the UK, the country is no exception to ensuring that it's part of the CCS scale-up. To support investable CCS project development at commercial scale, the UK is taking a comprehensive approach to develop sector-specific business models. The Dispatchable Power Agreement, for one, will support the decarbonisation of power systems and will incentivize investment in the technology. A business model for large-scale power BECCS projects is also in steady development. Carbon dioxide removals technologies such as DAC will also be critical to tackle residual emissions on the path to net zero. To support investment towards these technologies is the GGR business model, or the engineered greenhouse gas removals business model. To speak to us about that and more, I would like to introduce you to the experts from the UK government. Joanna Warner is the Deputy Director of Net Zero Frameworks and an expert on the GGR business model. I'll first begin with you, Joanna, to provide an overview of GGR. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to assume everybody can hear and see me unless I get some messages otherwise, but thank you very much for inviting me along today. As Dominic said, I am a Deputy Director within the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero in the UK, and my team has policy responsibility for what we call greenhouse gas removal technologies, by which we are really referring to engineered technologies, but also elsewhere I know called carbon dioxide removals, CDR. We call them GGRs in the UK. So this afternoon I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the context for greenhouse gas removals in the UK, our aims and ambitions and why they matter for achieving net zero. The sort of state of the development of the industry in the UK and what government needs to do to help it grow. And then I guess to really get into the meat of it, give you an overview of the key design aspects of the business model that we're developing to support GGRs. I'm going to say a little bit about our work on standards and methodologies, which is really critical part of the jigsaw. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about the process that we're in at the moment to potentially deploy some of the first GGR projects in the UK and how we are running that through the CCS programme. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is just a little bit of context, which may well be familiar to a lot of you, so I won't spend too much time on it, but greenhouse gas removal technologies, as you will know, are technologies that provide highly durable removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. And we know, both in the UK and globally, that they are a critical part of reaching our climate targets, which in the UK is to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050. Globally, the IPCC has said that these technologies are unavoidable to meet the ambition of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And in our own analysis within the UK, which initially came out in our net zero strategy, we're looking at potentially requiring sort of in the range of 75 to 81 megatons of CO2 per year of engineered removals by 2050. And they're really critical. We're clear in our policy framework that abatement comes first, and that wherever possible, sectors should be abating their carbon and reducing emissions. But we know that we're not going to be able to reduce emissions completely to zero by 2050. There are some sectors where it's extremely hard to sort of abate those final emissions, in some sectors like aviation and agriculture and some industry. And that's why negative emissions technologies, greenhouse gas emissions technologies, is so important for us, but also globally, because that challenge is not unique to the UK. But there's also economic opportunities that we see for the UK. There's a report from Be Zero Carbon that by 2050 the global market for GGRs could be worth up to $6.5 trillion. So this is has the potential to be a really massive global industry, and I'll talk a little bit later on about why the UK is a great place to deliver these technologies, but it's a kind of eye-watering size of the prize, and something that we see real opportunities in. This slide just illustrates that there's a portfolio of technologies that we include within engineered GGRs: DACs, direct air capture, BECCS, some ocean removals, biochar, buildings. Some of these technologies are all at different levels of development, and we have more sort of science and assurance behind some of them than the others, but it is a whole portfolio, and that's quite important to our approach and how we think about business model and other support. And also just to say that I won't be talking about nature-based removals today, but we absolutely recognise that they're part of the picture as well. But both our own analysis and people like the Climate Change Committee and the IPCC are clear that nature-based removals on their own won't be enough for us to meet our climate targets. Could I have the next slide, please? So just to say a little bit more about what we think needs to happen in the sector in the UK in order to meet our climate targets. So to meet our carbon budgets 5 and 6, we're currently in carbon budget 4, we know that we'll require a rapid scale up of GGRs, to the extent that GGRs could become the largest user of the UK's carbon capture and storage network by the mid-2030s. As I said a moment ago, we'll need to maintain a portfolio approach, both of non-biomass technologies like DAC and biomass like BECCS, and in order to meet our carbon budget sustainably. It's our view that we can't just rely on, we can't sort of pick a winner out of those, that the scale of removals that we're going to need and some of the practicalities about deploying that means that we need to be using the full range of GGR technologies. We're also, as I said earlier, there are some other forms of technologies that aren't connected to CCS infrastructure, like storage in products like concrete, or things like biochar applied to soils. We're supporting research and innovation into those technologies, which we know can make a contribution, although probably smaller in scale than the CCS-enabled GGRs. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know we need them, and we know that we need to grow the market pretty quickly from something very small at the moment to something that's delivering large amounts of carbon emissions into the 2030s and beyond. So why does government need to intervene? Well, at the moment, the basic problem that we have is that there's little market for negative emissions. There are voluntary markets. There are some great things that we see happening, but not at the scale that we'll need. And commercial GGR projects are largely not investable at the moment because the cost of deployment is higher than the prices that can be obtained on the market for the negative emissions that they produce. And as this is a new sector, there's also a lack of trusted standards and methodologies which enable us to quantify the amount of CO2 being removed kind of accurately and with assurance that they are doing what they say they are. So it's really clear that having reputable, robust standards recognised by government will be an important part of the jigsaw to attract more people into the market so that they can have confidence in the products that we're buying. So there's a number of policy interventions that we're making to address these barriers, including innovation funding to kind of get the science off the ground, prove different technologies or develop different technologies. We're developing the UK emissions trading scheme as a long-term market for GGRs. We've recently committed to developing our own standards and methodologies in the UK that projects will have to comply with. And then the final thing, which is the key focus for this session, is the GGR business model, which aims to attract investment by providing revenue support for negative emissions, which will be operating under a private law contract model. So we can move on to the next slide. Here we go. Thank you. This sets out the sort of basic building blocks, the basic structure of the business model. And I should say that we have done a call for evidence. We've done a formal consultation over the last year or so. We have developed this in really close engagement with stakeholders. I'm sure some of you on this webinar have contributed to that, and certainly while we've got some good building blocks, there's more to do to work through the detail, and we'll certainly want to engage more on that as we work through the detail. But look, where are we now in terms of our business model development? So we published some more details about it in December, and we set out that the business model will provide revenue support for 15 years based on a contract for difference model. When we consulted, we looked at a few different models for how we could provide revenue support, and broadly speaking, the contract for difference was the preferred option from the majority of stakeholders, not least because it's a tried and tested mechanism across UK government to provide revenue certainty for low carbon technologies. I mentioned the emissions trading scheme a moment ago, and we have said that we see that in the long term being the market for negative emissions. So it's really important that as we design the business model, we've got an eye to that long-term vision for the ETS, and so it's important that we're designing it to harness the potential benefits of the ETS, but also the voluntary carbon market, which exist at the moment and where GGRs can participate already. I'll talk in a minute about the reference price and the structure of the contract for difference, so I perhaps won't dwell on that now, but worth saying that initial deployment, sort of first wave of GGR technologies deploying will be through the CCS clusters sequencing program, and again shortly before Christmas, we opened the application process for the HyNet Track 1 expansion. I'll talk a little bit more about the detail of that later, but that was the first time that GGR projects were eligible to apply for to be part of that programme. There's an application process that will be seen through, so there's no sort of announcements or indeed guarantees for projects that have applied, but that was a really big moment for us, and really exciting that we have the route for the first GGR projects to come through. I'll move on to the next slide. So this is where we start to get into the structure and design of the business model. So as I said, the business model will be based on a contract for difference model. That's in line with, I know what my colleague is, Ben is going to talk about in terms of the PowerBex, large-scale PowerBex business model. And the basic sort of structure of that is that the contract for difference will pay projects the difference between a strike price and a reference price. That may be familiar to you from renewables projects. So the strike price represents the cost of delivering the negative emissions plus a reasonable rate of return for projects. And the reference price reflects the market value of negative emissions credits. I'll talk a bit about both of those and the complexities of them later. On the strike price, at least initially, the strike price will be project specific and agreed bilaterally with projects. And we're considering exactly which costs will be eligible to be included within the strike price. So look, it ought to be obvious, but the primary aim of the business model is to support the production of negative emissions. So a very pure view would be that that's all we support, that's all we take account of when we look at the strike price. However, we know that in reality, for some technologies, it's difficult, perhaps impossible, to distinguish between costs that are negative emissions related and costs that are related to other parts of operating the project. So in these circumstances, we're looking at how we can, we're not necessarily seeking to sort of try and divide those up artificially or where it can't be done, but looking at whether there's a deducting the revenues from the sale of co-products from the difference payment, so that we're avoiding overcompensation of basically government and taxpayer money subsidising something that has a value in the market. We're also exploring how co-product revenues and also technologies that could attract multiple subsidies or multiple incentives, how do we manage that within the business model to ensure both, you know, value for money from the government perspective and also ensure we're complying with subsidy control. The final sort of part of this aspect of the model is transport and storage costs, where in line with other business models, the transport and storage costs will be supported via the GGR business model. And we expect that those will be calculated and paid separately to the strike price again, which is in line with how other business models have dealt with T&S costs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as we said, the subsidy from government under the contract for difference is determined by the difference between the strike price and the reference price. And I've talked about the strike price, which is there to reflect the costs to the business of delivering negative emissions. So the reference price is aiming to reflect the market value of those negative emissions. And this is really challenging because there is currently no very large and liquid market for negative emissions. So how do we work out what a sensible and fair reference price is? What we set out in December is that we're minded to set the reference price based on a particular the developer in question's achieved sales price for GGR credits in certain approved markets, given that we don't really have a reliable sort of benchmark price at the moment. And this reflects the approach, again, taken in the hydrogen production business model. So what that means is that in the GGR business model, the reference price basically represents the sales price achieved by the developer, whether that's the sales price in the voluntary carbon market, or eventually it could be the sales price in the UK emissions trading scheme. We also are keen to make sure, as you'd expect, that developers are looking to achieve the highest possible sales price, because there is clearly potential here to perhaps not have all the incentives to do that, given that government will make up the difference. So we are looking at developing a price discovery incentive as a proportion of the achieved sales price, to sort of provide an additional incentive for projects to kind of get that best possible price on the carbon markets. And finally, we are thinking about whether to implement a floor price, which is the red line along the bottom of that chart, and whether there's any support required to mitigate volume risk that could be faced by developers. So those are some issues that are very live and we're thinking about at the moment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I said earlier that one of the critical things, and whether you're thinking about how we develop and implement a business model that can work and provides good value for taxpayer money, or whether you're thinking about trying to operate in a voluntary carbon market or operating within a regulated market like the UK emissions trading scheme, is standards and methodologies. And as we're saying, for these technologies, particularly the newer ones, that's a very new and developing area, but really important for the integrity of projects and the schemes sort of supporting them, that we know that these projects are reliably storing the CO2 that they say they are, and storing the CO2 permanently. So UK government commissioned a independent review of existing GGR standards last year to help us get a better evidence base for what standards and methodologies already exist. And at the point that review was done over last year, there was no single existing standard that would be able to cover all the engineered GGR's technologies that we're thinking about being in scope for our business model. So based on this report, the consultations that we've done, the government set out that we intend to develop our own methodologies and standards to support the business model, rather than endorse one or multiple third-party methodologies. That process will take a bit of time. These things can't be developed overnight. So for early projects, we envisage we're likely to define sort of quality thresholds for early projects rather than full standards, as a bit of a stepping stone on the way to full standards. And obviously important that we're looking at best practice and existing standards, for example, CCS regulations, to keep in step with the other things that are out there. Next slide, please. And then last slide from me. As I mentioned, we opened applications for GGR projects to take part in the Track 1 expansion process in the HyNet cluster of the in HyNet. And I just wanted to show you the eligibility criteria that we are applying for any GGR projects that wish to take part in this process. I should say, this is no guarantee necessarily of the eligibility criteria that will be there for the business model in future or for future CCS processes. But I do think it's helpful to see the sorts of things that we're looking at and how we have defined it for the process that is ongoing at the moment. I think I won't read them all out because that's very boring for you. You can read them on the screen, but there's things in there about location obviously needing to be near the cluster. They have to be providing negative emissions, obviously, but also some more detailed criteria around BECCS projects in particular. Just as I say, the process opened in December. The first sort of stage of it was a expression of interest process, which closed at the beginning of February, and then there'll be final applications across the whole suite of technologies eligible at the end of March. That's it from me. I think there may be some questions, but thank you very much for listening.
Joanna, thank you very much for these very insightful slides from this presentation. Indeed, I do have some questions. The first one, if you don't mind, is why should GGR developers and projects come to the UK?
Thank you. So I think I said at the start, no, this is going to be a global challenge and a global market. So it's a really kind of great question about why the UK. So look, in the UK, we really strongly believe that we're well positioned to be a global leader in GGR technologies. We've got the world-class research institutions, we've got excellent engineering expertise, and we have access to geological storage through the CCS infrastructure that we have. And on a sort of policy level, we've been really clear from the net zero strategy onwards about the importance of GGRs in our efforts to tackle climate change. And that's been recognised by people like the Climate Change Committee, who are our independent advisors on how we meet our carbon targets. So it's very much sort of part of our policy framework as well. So we've set out our long-term ambitions for a competitive negative emissions market. We've signalled that we intend to include negative emissions and GGRs in the UK ETS. And in the nearer term, that's a slightly longer term thing, but in the nearer term, as I've just been talking about, we're putting in place the business model support that will be so important to overcome the immediate barriers to deployment. As I said, people on this call may be interested to look at some of the documents we put out in December, which set out a bit more detail than I've been able to give today about the business model. There were some draft heads of terms for how the business model will work. And we have this fabulous CCS program, which I'm sure other people are going to be talking about. I talked a bit about the track one expansion process in HyNet, but we've already got, I think, up to £20 billion for the early deployment of CCS. Not just GTRs, all the CCS technologies, but you know, there is some serious commitment behind it. Yeah. And I guess the last thing I say, I guess, is just linked to that sort of one of the first points I made about our research and engineering and science, and that's something we've really supported. We've put £100 million into research and innovation for GGRs, and that programme is ongoing. And I think we've got over 15 or around 15 demonstration projects going at the moment. So we're really trying to support right from that sort of innovation stage to deployment and future long-term carbon markets and negative emissions markets.
Sounds pretty appealing to me. On to my second question. What are the main challenges of designing a business model to apply across a range of technologies?
Yeah, again, really interesting question, and it is a challenging aspect of the work we're doing, but it's also, I think, the right thing to do. And I talked a bit at the start about the different GGR technologies that are out there, and I think there's two reasons why we're sort of trying to keep that portfolio of technologies within our policy, within our business model. The first is that our carbon targets and the global carbon targets are ambitious, and I don't think one technology is going to suffice to hit them all. So we need a range. And there's also something about these are early stage, these are innovative technologies, so it's wise to keep our options as open as we can while things develop and we see how different technologies develop. So that's been sort of central to how we've been developing the business model, and we continue to, that we want to keep it as open to a variety of different negative emissions technologies as possible, and sort of focus on the outcome we want to incentivize, which is emissions removal. That said, we have the CCS program, which is deploying, and so initially we are focusing on deploying projects through the CCS clusters, because that's a great delivery mechanism that we have now, and that could cover a variety of technologies, DACs, BECCS, and BECCS across a range of sectors, whether it's power, hydrogen, or biomethane. And we expect, for the most part, standard T's and C's in the GGR contract can kind of work irrespective of technology. But we also do understand that these projects are diverse, and so the business model will have to have provisions that are specific to the technology. So that's something we're thinking about. And again, it's relevant to the standards and methodologies that we've talked about, and they will have to be sort of bespoke to different technologies. But again, in the end, all trying to reward the same thing, the negative emissions. So yeah, definitely complex, and it's not without its challenges, but we do think it's sort of worth the effort to get that diverse portfolio.
Absolutely. And what about the GGR business model credits? What is the government doing to ensure there is demand for them? And how will this demand be generated across voluntary and compliance markets?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this. Our intention is that engineered GGR's projects under the business model can generate high quality carbon credits that can be sold on high integrity negative emissions markets. And it's important to us that we design the business model in a way that allows all of us to maximize the benefits of the voluntary carbon markets. We definitely don't want to sort of crowd those out or make our projects sort of inoperable with them. That's not the outcome that we want. Standards and methodologies will be really important, because that's something that projects need to be able to participate in the voluntary carbon markets. In terms of sort of voluntary carbon markets more broadly, so the government announced last year, I think, that we'll be consulting soon on specific steps and interventions to sort of protect against greenwashing and some of the problems we've seen. And we support things like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets and the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. We'll be consulting, as I think I mentioned, on integrating GGRs into the UK ETS in the longer term, and that consultation will be looking at things like how we make sure we have the right standards, and how we manage the potential impacts of that on the market, and what eligibility criteria there might be set, and so on. So yeah, again, it's another really challenging area of our policy development, but it's one that's important we get right, because that's the vision longer term, that it's the carbon markets that are the real driver of negative emissions. But we know there's work that needs to be done to get us to that place.
Yeah. Final question. What are the next steps on the development in the government's own standards and methodologies? And how does this interact with the wider work ongoing in sort of biomass sustainability?
Yeah. So, as I said, I don't think you can overstate how important this is. It's sort of the thing, getting this right is what makes everything else work. And so we've, as I said, set out at the end of last year that the UK government intends to define methodologies that GGRs that we support basically will need to meet rather than endorse third-party ones, because having looked at it, we haven't seen anything that we think sort of does everything we need it to do. And as I said, that'll take a bit of time. So for early projects, it might be a sort of slightly more minimum quality thresholds or something a bit more, rather than a full-blown standard, something a bit more bespoke for early projects. Interaction with wider biomass policy you asked me about. So again, the broad position is government only supports the use of sustainable biomass, and in other schemes, generators only receive subsidies for biomass that meets specific sustainability criteria. We set our biomass strategy last year, and this year there'll be a further consultation, including developing and implementing a cross-sectoral sustainability framework. And the aim of that is to create a bit more consistency across the sectors and make sure that we are sort of strengthening our sustainability criteria even more. And GGR projects will have to look across to that, as we develop our own standards, that will be in line with the sustainability framework that's being developed. There may be other specific things that we need for GGRs, but absolutely those things need to be in step and in line. That's something we're very aware of.
It's very clear to me. Thank you so much, Joanna, for all of your input and answering these questions. It's been great. And it's great to see how the GGR business model is developing and the opportunities that will come along with it, I'm sure. Okay.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Been a pleasure. Thank you. I'll move on to our next speaker, who is Ben Smith. And Ben will walk us through the efforts being taken to deploy CCS across power generation. Now, Ben is the Deputy Director of Power CCS at the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. And he's also the expert on the dispatchable power agreement and the PowerBEX business models. So, Ben, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And Ben Smith, look after the Power CCS team here in DESNZ, and have been working on the dispatchable power agreement pretty much over the last 3 years or so now, and really looking forward to kind of walking through that. If I could just move on to the next slide, please. So the two areas that I'm going to cover in this presentation are to give a bit of an overview on the dispatchable power agreement, what are the kind of broad principles of it, how we've built it up over time, where are the risks, and how we've built the model. And then I'll move on to talk about the PowerBEX business model, where we've got to date, some of the publications that we've made, and then talk about what's next for that business model as well. So just to start with then, just to set the objective really here, the DPA, Dispatchable Power Agreement as we call it, is to help deliver emissions reductions and achieve the carbon budget targets that we've set ourselves in the UK. To do this, we're going to implement the Dispatchable Power Agreement, which essentially is a 15-year contract funded by the electricity supplier obligation. Essentially will be funded by electricity consumers, and the key objective is to bring forward at least one power CCUS plant by the mid-2020s through the CCUS clustering sequencing process that's ongoing now. And then in order to do that, we set ourselves kind of 3 key policy objectives that we needed to solve through the development of the DPA, and that is to achieve flexibility. So we were really clear that we wanted the DPA to be a flexible generating unit, so it would be able to operate mid-merit, would respond to existing market signals there. The other key area is obviously making it affordable for consumers, demonstrating value for money, making sure that it doesn't put onerous costs onto electricity consumers. So one of the fundamental principles, policy principles of the DPA was around affordability and value for money. And then the other key area like any kind of business model, you need to make sure it's investable. You need to make sure that projects can come forwards and they can raise finance off the back of this, and then they can get the project away. So we also, a theme that runs throughout the DPA is that investability piece. How do we make sure that that banks and lenders and projects will be able to finance these projects, particularly as the level of capex required to do so. There's a lot there. So and then overarching all of that, we had to make sure that it had the minimum necessary support compatible with our own fiscal rules as well. Next slide, please. So just to pick out that flexibility point, because it's a really key point for the dispatchable power agreement, we needed to make sure that a plant operating flexibly in dispatch mode, it will obviously in today's market faces uncertainties regarding its load factor. The biggest problem, therefore, how do you raise significant amounts of capex against a backdrop of uncertainty in terms of its load factors? So the key kind of area within the DPA that we've looked to help address that is by bringing in what we call an availability payment. The availability payment essentially looks to help recover the cost for the plant of building out the capture unit, the CCS unit, on top of a generating unit. And the way that it does that essentially is directly linking the payment to a number of key kind of areas, which is what's the plant's availability, so how much are they available, and then how much of the plant is capturing its carbon, what's the carbon capture rate achieved on the plant. And those two variables are the two big driving factors that sit behind the availability payment, which underpins the whole of the DPA. And the size of the payment is ultimately set through either a competitive process in the longer term or in the shorter term. They're bilaterally negotiated. I can ask you to move on to the next slide, please. And then, as I mentioned, another key area of the DPA is the affordability, making sure it represents value for money for consumers. So based on 2021 UK carbon prices, a power plant would have been out of merit compared to an unabated equivalent due to its increased OPEX costs as a result of the CCS plant. So what we've done is we've brought in what we call a variable payment. That's almost like a top-up payment. And what that does is it looks to take into consideration the additional costs that a CCUS plant will face over and above its unabated equivalent in terms of additional fuel costs. And it's also underpinned, obviously, by how much revenue or how much it will avoid in terms of carbon pricing. So the two big drivers there: what are they paying for fuel, and what's the carbon price? And so, in certain scenarios, there is where perhaps carbon prices are really low and fuel costs are really high. It was appropriate to bring forwards a vehicle that made sure that our DPA plant was at least in line with its unabated equivalent, and that's when we expect a variable payment, e.g. a top-up payment, to kick in, and that's to help bring that plant in the merit order, but not ahead of other lower carbon alternative plants. And the key to that is obviously making sure that the plant still responds to market signals, but can ultimately run ahead of its unabated equivalent. Next slide, please. So just to talk through in a very simplistic way, I guess, of the actual payment mechanism itself. The DPA, as I mentioned, has two key payment mechanisms: the availability payment and the variable payment. So the availability payment is essentially to provide that kind of missing money, the money that it costs in terms of capex costs to build the CCUS capture plant. And as I mentioned in the earlier slide, this is made up essentially of the availability of generation. So how much is that plant available throughout the year? And it uses that as essentially as a number and times it by how much does it capture when it is generating. Does it get to 95%? Does it get to 98%? The incentive, therefore, is on the generator to maximize its capture rate, maximize its availability of generation. And then ultimately, what's the overall size of the plant, what we call the net dependable capacity. And you take those three variables and apply that to your APR, which, as I mentioned, is the number that gets either competitively tendered through the process going forwards, or as we've currently seen through the track 1 negotiations with a project at the moment, NZT will bilaterally agree what that number looks like, and essentially then you get payments made over the 15 years, over the term of the contract, to allow you to recover that APR. And so the incentive clearly is on the generator to make itself available and to maximize its capture rate as well. The other element there that's kind of grayed out is the T&S capacity charge. That is another element to the availability payment, but essentially it's a cost pass through, and it essentially picks up the cost of the capacity charges on the T&S network. And then the other payment mechanism under the DPA is the variable payment, which I mentioned before. Again, two driving factors behind whether that kicks in or not is the carbon price and essentially the fuel cost price. In this equation, we put it as the gas cost differential. So this is to help bridge the gap between when perhaps carbon prices are really low, gas prices are really high, and our CCS plant has lower load factors, lower efficiencies, because it's obviously running the capture unit and therefore pushes down the efficiency rating. And it's to help bridge that gap and bring it in line with its unabated equivalent. Okay, next slide, please. So I thought it would be also important just to cover kind of what guarantees there are under the DPA, what caps there are under the DPA, and where the risks sit under the DPA. So to be clear, there are no guarantees under the DPA for a minimum revenue. As I mentioned before, the availability payment and the variable payment are driven by those factors mentioned and can fall to zero. So there's no guarantee under the DPA of profit. If projects don't perform in the market, then they can't achieve their anticipated returns. The onus is on the generating unit, as I say, to kind of respond to market signals, run when it needs to, and then maximize its capture rate and maximize its availability of generation. There's no guarantee under the DPA of usage either. So while the variable payment helps to bring the CCS plan in line with its unabated equivalent, it doesn't influence or provide it with additional market signals to run. The generating unit will make those decisions purely on its own basis. So there's nothing in the DPA that incentivizes the generating unit to run over and above the existing market arrangements for all other generating units. There's no cap under the DPA on profits. So although we may ensure a gain share mechanism will be applied, this is likely to entitle the DPA counterparty up to 30% share of any gains that we think are over and above a certain threshold, and that would be agreed on a bilateral basis. There's also no cap on losses either. So there will be no pain share mechanism. It is possible, as I mentioned before, under the DPA design, that generator receives no subsidy payments nor any market revenues. That's completely down to the generating unit itself. Risk under the DPA, the majority of those are held by the generating unit because they're clearly in control of those risks. Where they're not in control of those risks, things like construction risks, when they run or not, how much carbon they capture, how available the plant is. We're over and above those risks that are completely controlled by the generating unit. There are some cross-chain risks, predominantly to do with things like the T&S performance, so when it's available, when it might become available in the first instance, how often it's available through the life of it. Those that are outside of the generating units controlled are held by the DPA counterparty, and they're the only risks that are so. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on now to the PowerBex business model, and I'll just give an overview of the work that we've done in this area. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So just to give a bit of an explanation of what PowerBex is, I'm sure a lot of you on the call will be already familiar with this, but just to set that out. So PowerBex is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage on, and it's the process of using both sustainable feedstocks and a fuel combustion process to generate electricity and then capture the carbon and permanently store that. And that's what we call PowerBECCS. PowerBECCS provides low carbon generation and delivers economy-wide negative emissions. Negative emissions are key to meeting the government's decarbonisation strategy. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there's just a little chart that shows the kind of the amount of negative emissions that we expect to capture and how we're going to meet our carbon budget targets. A lot of that is coming from PowerBECCS and BECCS more broadly. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to put that into a little bit of context here, I thought it was worth just pointing out some of the key ambitions and targets that we've set ourselves in the UK. So first of all, there's the target of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And within the CCS program, we've got an ambition of having stored and captured 20 to 30 million tons of CO2 by 2030. And that includes at least 10 million tons of CO2 by 2030 in track 2. And we will announce more as a program around the process for bringing forwards investment in track 2 projects this year. Support under the CCS is in at least 2 industrial clusters by the mid-2020s and a further 2 by the 2030, which we hope to support at least 50,000 jobs in 2030. We've set ourselves an ambition of deploying at least 1 power CCS plant in the mid-2020s and look to bring forwards multiple additional CCS projects by 2030 to support that longer term decarbonisation of power by 2035 and obviously meeting net zero emissions by 2050. Up to 1 gigawatt of CCS enabled hydrogen in operation under construction by 2025 and 10 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production capacity by 2030. Additionally, capturing up to 6 million tonnes of a year of CO2 by industrial emissions by 2030 and 9 million tonnes by 2035. And then critically important, particularly in my role in PowerBECCS, deploying at least 5 million tonnes of engineered CO2 removals by 2030, rising to 23 million tonnes by 2035. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to have a little bit of a look and an overview on the business model for PowerBECCS itself, essentially highlighting 4 key policy areas for us to evolve and to tackle as part of that development of that business model. The first there being negative emissions, as I mentioned in the previous slide, critically important to helping the UK meet its carbon reduction targets. And ultimately part of the key policy business model, part of the key policy area within the business model itself is right to incentivize large scale negative emissions. Energy security, a critical part, particularly in the late 2020s, ensuring power production to contribute to help to meet that target, help sustain energy security. Affordability, I mentioned this within the DPA, again, critically important within the PowerBECCS business model as well, making sure ultimately we represent value for money for consumers. And then investability as well. Again, critical whenever you build a business model, you ultimately have to make sure it's investable, making sure that we've got the right balance of risk and reward in the project, making sure that we're not overpaying for risk to be borne by a developer, making sure we get the right balance of that throughout the business model and throughout the contract. And then just to summarize the box at the end there, the PowerBECCS business model is designed to support projects which have a minimum abated power generation capacity of 100 megawatts and above. So Joe talked a little bit about the business model for GGRs. This is specifically for those projects that have a minimum abated power generation capacity of 100 megawatts or above. Could just ask next slide, please. Okay, some of the key elements that we've been working on and will continue to work on this year, I thought might be important to pull out. And Joe talked about the criticality of setting the right biomass strategy from a sustainability criteria. That fundamentally is absolutely critically important to whatever we do in PowerBex. You have to get the right sustainability criteria in place, and this sets the supply chain emissions and the sustainability requirements on the feedstock, ultimately ensuring that biomass genuinely contributes to decarbonisation. Legislation, making sure that we've got the right legislation in place to be able to sign and build a business model off the back of that. Really important that we continue to make those changes in legislation. We've already done some. We need to do more around that as well. Payment mechanisms, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute as part of the work that we've done and the updates that we've provided to date, but making sure that we provide developers and investors with clarity around how our revenues will be generated. Again, building on the point that I made around investability. And then clarifying the role of both the voluntary carbon markets and the compliance markets, such as the ETS, to support negative emissions. When I talk a little bit in a minute about the payment mechanisms, again, critically important that we understand those markets and how PowerBex generators will play a part in helping to evolve those markets further. Next slide, please. Okay, so the PowerBex business model will be based on a dual CFD model as consulted on previously. And that will essentially have two elements to it, both a CFDE and a CFDC element. And each of these difference payments will be based on both a strike price and a reference price. And this is like a traditional CFD where we agree a strike price with a project, and then we reflect on what the reference price and how the reference price is made up. And that's consistent for both the CFDC and CFDE. And then additionally to that, there will be, as with the DPA, a transport and storage payment, and that's to reflect essentially the cost borne by the TNS companies in passing through the CO2 through their network, and will ultimately be borne by consumers at the end of that. So our expectation is that carbon credits will be sold in the appropriate markets, either the ETS, perhaps in the longer term, but more in the short term, probably the voluntary carbon markets. Just go on to the next slide, please. Again, some recent updates that we've put out on the PowerBex business model in both what I talked there through in terms of the reference price on the CFDE and the term length as well. So in December 2023, just gone, we put an update out to our minded two positions, and just to pick up those a little bit further, we've said that the contract term we expect to be a 15-year, which hopefully ensures the right balance between subsidy costs, investment, and achieving negative emissions in the longer term. There is potential for that scope to be extended, subject to agreement. Baseline market reference price was the reference price that we've selected for the CFDE element, and at the bottom of the slide there, you'll see a table which shows some of the options that we explored, with ultimately the justification behind the BMRP, which essentially was about promoting baseload generation. That's really important when you look at maximizing the level of negative emissions. That's how you get to your carbon budget targets. Currently, it's used within the current baseload generations for CFDs. So it's a model and a reference price that the market already knows and is currently in use. Incentivize generators to make season ahead sales, ultimately providing liquidity into forward power sales markets. That's good for consumers, good for the projects. They get long-term certainty in terms of power sales. They can link that then with their procurement strategy of the biomass as well. PowerBex projects aren't necessarily suited to dispatchable profile due to the startup and shutdown capabilities. And again, just to re-emphasize the point that I made at the beginning, which is maximizing that negative emissions as well. So BMRP, we felt overall represented the kind of best stable market conditions, which ultimately is the most investable option and provides probably the best value for money for consumers as well. And that was the reason for choosing BMRP as a reference price, and hence why we put that out in December. The reference price for the CFDC is likely to be based on achieved sales. We're still doing further work to look into that market, as kind of Jo alluded to in her presentation. The actual price achieved by the developer for negative emissions credits sold in the approved markets is the basis that we'll probably use for that, as well as the reference price. Moving on to the next slide then, please. Okay, and then just to give a bit of a summary on the kind of publications that we've done today. I mentioned previously about engagement being really important for us. So we're really keen to make sure that we put out regular updates and give people the options to see how the business model evolves. It's definitely something that we learn in developing the dispatchable power agreement. So in October 2021, we put out the BECS Power Report investigating the difference between the business model options that we had for Power BECS. I mentioned there about the dual CFDE, CFDC. That was one of those options and one of the options that was recommended as part of that report. And then in August 22, we consulted seeking views on those potential business models and closed that consultation and put out a response to that consultation in March 2023, confirming the dual CFD and that was our intended mechanism for the Power BECS business model. In August 2023, there was a task and finish report outlining how Power BECS is able to generate negative emissions. And then, as I mentioned previously, in December 2023, we've put out jointly with the GGR publication updates to the business model that I've just gone through as well. Some immediate priorities for us to develop over the coming months. So design of the price discovery incentive options for setting a price floor for CFDC, options for volume support to mitigate the risks of any shortfall in market demand for GGR credits, and some detailed considerations on the interactions of the CFDE and CFDC reference prices as well. Obviously, as we continue to evolve the policy, it's important for us to look at those interactions between the CFDE, CFDC, make sure that we've got the right balance, make sure that we understand the implications as we evolve the policy and we make decisions around some of the detailed findings of that as well, make sure we understand the interactions and be cognizant of those. We plan to do further updates on the design of the business model, and hopefully we'll be putting out further publications this year. We really, really value the engagement that we get from stakeholders. We run stakeholder events, we put out the regular publications and updates to the business model. Yeah, and we really, really value that. So I would continue to welcome input from stakeholders on that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I think that's that concludes the two kind of updates or overviews of the business models that I've been working on and leading on. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Ben. That was a great presentation. Very, very insightful and quite exhaustive, actually. I do have a few questions for you. So if you don't mind, I'll start with how did DESNZ choose the dual contracts for difference?
Yeah, so I think I probably alluded to that in the slides, but just to pull that out. So essentially, Power BECS projects provided feedback on a report that we commissioned, which was entitled Investable Commercial Frameworks for Power BECS, and that was provided by Element Energy and Vivid Economics. The report explored a number of power potential business model solutions and made a recommendation based on their assessment of the options. Helpfully, it also identified the key risks for investors and aiming to support the deployment of Power BECS. In the feedback that we received from projects around that, they specifically pointed to several kind of risks around the biomass plants and the CCS projects themselves, such as the high feedstock price volatilities and the cross-chain risks. those are all barriers that we had to make sure that we acknowledged in the development of the business model. So the dual CFD felt like it was the recommended and identified as the most investable business model for addressing those identified risks, and that was the one that we chose, and we went out and consulted on that, and got consistent feedback to say, I think out of all of them, that was probably the best fit for purpose model to choose.
Okay, well, that's great. And second question, what are the learnings you can take from the DPA model into the design of the PowerBex model?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot, but probably to pick up on one in particular, I think it's probably the external engagement really helped us. When you're developing complex policy, it's really, really helpful to be able to test your thinking and the evidence and supporting info that you've got and get constructive feedback on that. And that really helped us get a wide range of views from across all the different stakeholders and really critically help us consider the policy positions that we were ultimately making. Early engagement with lenders as well. So getting opportunity, I talked about the critical importance of making sure that business models are investable. That helped us to continually learn from investors as well along the way. What I often hear is that the DPA has the right balance of risk and places the management of those risks on those who can manage them best. We wanted to make sure that we ensure that continues to happen for the PowerBex business model as well. So this is why we've really focused time and effort, I guess, into replicating all of the kind of external engagements, both that we've done through consultations, update to business models, engagement groups that we've run, where we've really listened and kind of tried to talk people through, the complexity of the policy positions and get feedback along the way. And I think that's probably on reflection, probably been the single biggest thing that I'd point to is the kind of thing that we've taken in terms of lessons learned and really tried to embed within the work that we're doing on PowerBex.
Very good. And over the next few months, what's going to be the focus for the PowerBex model?
Yeah, so this is going to be we've got a lot planned. We're ambitious for this year. Some of our probably immediate priorities for the development include, I mentioned before, the design of the price discovery incentive and options for setting a price floor. Options for volume support to mitigate the risks of shortfalls in market demand for GGR credits. Joe picked that up, and it's a similar theme for the PowerBex business model. We're working closely with our GGR colleagues on that. Working through the sustainability requirements. Again, Joe mentioned this. It's really critically important that we continue to review those and where needed, make improvements or adjustments to those. Details on the payment and TNS charges under the PowerBex business model. Again, one of the key kind of cross-cutting chain risks that we see. We need to make sure that we get those right. And I mentioned the importance of investability. Within that, we need to consider the cross-chain risks, including relief, compensation, in respect of TNS commissioning delays or outage events. And then, consideration towards the PowerBex CFDC, CFDE, strike price, including cost distribution is critically important. These are all items that are really, really important for us to progress this year. So those are the things that we'll be working hard on over the coming months. And as I say, engagement externally on this is important. So we'll continue to make updates and to bring those things to our engagement groups.
Great, thank you. What about stakeholder feedback and considerations? Can you speak to the interaction between that and how these business models are now and how they might evolve?
Yes, as mentioned, stakeholder feedback is so hugely important in helping us shape the policy positions. And that's why I've been really keen to make sure we do as much as we can there. It does take time to get publications and consultations out, but I'm really keen to maximize the opportunity that we have. Hence why we run a lot of stakeholder engagement exercises with on a regular basis, both with our GGR colleagues and on our own. We've done numerous consultations, and we've made several publications and updates to the policy as well, to give a flavour of the policy direction that we're going in. We really welcome that feedback, and you can see from the publications that I talked through that we've made in the past, we really listen to the feedback that we get, and we're able to kind of bring that thinking into the policy positions and keep reflecting on it, and making sure ultimately we come with the right solution. So it's been really valuable. It was one of the lessons that we learned out of the DPA. I continue to see it being a key focus for us in the PowerBex team as well.
Okay, great. And what about private finance, Ben? How do you see that playing a role in the future?
Yeah, good question. So private finance is really has a really important role to play here. Government subsidies, and I mentioned around electricity supply obligation being the kind of main vehicle for remunerating these kinds of policies. But those alone are not going to deliver the types of projects we need to meet the ambitions that we've set ourselves. Those that I talked through in the slides, meeting the 2050 ambition, meeting the carbon reductions targets. It's therefore really important that we build business models that encourage private finance. And that's why I made those key points in my presentation about the importance of well-developed investable business models that are well engaged, tested with industry and investors along the way. We want to continue to build that, I guess refine our business models going forwards. We're also building off the work that we did in publishing the CCS vision in December, and we're hoping to find that longer term pathway to a fully self-sustaining CCS pathway that will help us in years to come.
Absolutely. Finally, last question. How is the government approaching biomass sustainability?
Yeah, so I think Jo picked this up as part of her presentation as well. So just to probably re-echo what she said and build on that a little bit, biomass plays a key role in delivering a more secure, clean sector for Britain, energy sector for Britain. It delivered around 9% of the UK's total energy supply in 2022. And as set out in the biomass strategy, who our colleagues are leading on, we'll be consulting on that later this year, and how we can strengthen our stringent sustainability criteria, including delivering and implementing a cross-sectoral sustainability framework to essentially to enable greater consistency across all sectors. So it's really important for us to continue to engage on this, and we'd really welcome input and views on that consultation that, as I mentioned, and as Jo mentioned, we plan to be running this year.
Fantastic. Ben, I think that brings us to the end of your presentation. So thank you very, very much. We've got some good attendance. And so now I'll just close off by, first of all, saying it's been a very interesting session. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to once again thank Ben Smith and Joanna Warner for their insights and their presentations. And I would also like to thank the team at the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero for their cooperation in getting part 2 of this webinar series on the status of CCS in the UK together. I think they're doing a fantastic job. On behalf of the Global CCS Institute, I would like to thank our audience for being here. Thank you all for your questions. While that's all the time we have for today, we'll do our best to address your inquiries in the future. If you would like to learn more about the status of CCS in the UK and globally, you can read our Global Status of CCS report, which is free for download at www.status23.globalccsinstitute.com. If you're on social media, feel free to follow or interact with us at Global CCS Institute, at Global CCS. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact us directly at info@globalccsinstitute.com. Please note that this session was recorded, so you can always have a catch up on our website in the coming days once we have a chance to upload that. And thanks again for joining us. Goodbye.